Her father had called it a marriage. Mylene, at 19, knew it for what it was, a sale. She stood on the dusty plank porch of the Prospect Creek General Store, her thin white dress a stark flag of surrender against the brown, thirsty landscape. Her father, his face a mask of shame and desperation, kept his eyes fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. He had lost the last of their money, the last of his pride, in a card game he never should have joined. The man who had won was not a card sharp from the saloons, but a name whispered with a mix of fear and respect in the small mining town. A man who lived apart, a man who came down from the peaks like a force of nature and left just as quietly. The man appeared then, his shadow falling over them long before he was close. He was enormous. Not merely tall, but broad, thick with the kind of muscle earned from a life of hard labor against rock and wood. His hair and beard were a tangled wilderness of dark brown, and his eyes, set deep beneath a heavy brow, were a startling, clear blue. He wore buckskin and leather, smelling of pine and cold air and something wild. He did not look at her father. His gaze fell on Mylene, and for a moment, she felt like a rabbit spotted by a hawk. There was no cruelty in his eyes, only a quiet, assessing weight. The agreement stands, her father stammered, not meeting the mountain man's gaze. The man, Walter, gave a slow, single nod. He did not offer a hand to shake. Instead, he reached into a leather satchel slung across his chest and produced a canvas sack. It was not large, but when he dropped it on the porch at her father's feet, it landed with a heavy, metallic thud that spoke of impossible density. Her father flinched at the sound. He knelt, his hands trembling, and loosened the drawstring. Inside, coins gleamed. Not silver dollars, but gold. A fortune. Enough to buy back his honor 10 times over, enough to return to San Francisco and start again. Enough to purchase his only daughter's future. Her father looked up, his eyes wet. He looked at the gold, then at Mylene. The choice was already made. He cinched the bag tight, clutching it to his chest as if it were a child. "She is a good girl," he said, his voice thick. "She works hard. She is obedient." He could not bring himself to say her name. Walter's gaze remained on Mylene. "Can you ride in a wagon?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. It was the first time he had spoken to her. Mylene gave a small, stiff nod. Words were a luxury she could not afford. She carried a small, tightly wrapped bundle, everything she owned in the world. It felt impossibly light compared to the sack of gold her father now possessed. Walter turned without another word and walked toward a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 formidable mules. He did not look back to see if she was following. He expected it. Her father was already scuttling away in the opposite direction, a ghost disappearing into the heat haze of the street. Mylene took a deep breath, the dust and sorrow of the moment catching in her throat. She clutched her small bundle and walked toward the wagon, toward the mountain, toward the man who had bought her. The world she knew was gone. The journey up the mountain was silent and jarring. The wagon jolted over rutted tracks that quickly gave way to a path only Walter and his mules seemed to comprehend. Mylene sat stiffly on the hard bench, her hands clutching her bundle in her lap. The town fell away below them, becoming a toy village before vanishing entirely behind a stand of imposing pines. The air grew cooler, cleaner, filled with the scent of resin and damp earth. Walter handled the mules with a quiet, confident ease, his huge hands gentle on the reins. He never spoke, his concentration fixed on the path ahead. Mylene watched him from the corner of her eye. He was a creature of this place, as much a part of the landscape as the granite cliffs and ancient trees. She was a hothouse flower, pale and fragile, transplanted into a wilderness that could crush her without a thought. After several hours, the path opened into a small, high meadow. A cabin stood at its edge, smoke curling from a stone chimney. It was not a crude shack, but a well-built structure of thick, expertly notched logs, with a proper porch and glass in the 2 small windows. A testament to its owner's strength and skill. As they drew closer, the cabin door opened. 2 small figures appeared. A girl of about 10, with a long, serious face and her father's clear blue eyes, stood with her arms crossed, a miniature sentinel. Beside her, a little boy, no more than 5, peeked out from behind her skirts, his thumb in his mouth. Walter brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. His movements seemed to lose their rough edge as he approached the children. "Sarah." "Thomas," he said, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. The girl, Sarah, did not smile. Her gaze flickered to my Leon in the wagon, sharp and suspicious. "Who is she?" she demanded, her voice high and clear. "This is my Leon," Walter said simply. "She will be staying with us." The boy, Thomas, stepped out from behind his sister, his curiosity overcoming his shyness. He stared at my Leon with wide, wondering eyes. My Leon felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, but these 2 small pairs were the most piercing. This was the wounded household the profile spoke of, a home built around an absence she could feel like a cold draft. There was no woman's touch in the stark neatness of the porch, no flowers in the waiting soil by the steps. Walter lifted her small bundle from the wagon as if it weighed nothing. He did not offer her a hand as she carefully climbed down, her legs stiff. She stood before the children, a stranger in a strange land. Sarah's glare was openly hostile. This was her domain, and my Leon was an invader. Thomas, however, took a hesitant step forward. He pointed a small, grubby finger at the intricate silk frog fastening on her dress. "Shiny," he whispered. Sarah grabbed his hand and pulled him back. "Don't," she hissed. Walter ignored the small drama. "Your room is this way," he said to my Leon, gesturing toward the cabin. He led her inside. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace and a heavy wooden table with 3 chairs. A 4th place was conspicuously absent. He led her to a small room at the back, barely larger than a closet, containing a narrow cot and a small chest. "This will be yours." He placed her bundle on the cot. He then unslung his own satchel and pulled out the second canvas sack, the one filled with gold. He set it on the floor in the corner of her room. It sat there, a silent, heavy promise and a constant reminder of their transaction. He left without another word, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the gold, the scent of pine, and the palpable grief that clung to the walls of her new prison. My Leon did not unpack. Her small bundle remained a tight knot of fabric on the cot, a symbol of her readiness to flee, though she had nowhere to go. For the first few days, she moved through the cabin like a ghost. Walter and his children had a rhythm, a routine born of loss and necessity, and she did not know where she fit. Walter rose before dawn, tended to his animals, and disappeared into the forest with his axe or rifle, returning only at dusk, weary and silent. Sarah managed the household with a grim competence that was unnatural for a child her age. She cooked their meager meals, scrubbed the floors, and bossed her little brother with a sharp tongue. She treated my Leon with a pointed indifference, never speaking to her directly, acting as if she were invisible. Only Thomas seemed to acknowledge her presence, his wide eyes following her every move. My Leon knew that silence would not earn her keep. Her father's words, "She is obedient, she works hard," echoed in her mind. It was all she had. So she began. She rose before anyone else, her footsteps silent on the wooden floors. She coaxed the embers in the fireplace back to life and had coffee brewing by the time Walter emerged from his room. The first time he saw the pot ready, he stopped in the doorway, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but he said nothing. He simply poured a cup and took it to the porch. It was a start. She began to notice the small things. The bread Sarah baked was dense and heavy. The stew was bland, made only of salted meat and potatoes. The children's clothes were clean but patched with clumsy, thick stitches. One small thing at a time, she began to change them. She found wild onions and garlic growing at the edge of the woods and added them to the stew pot. The aroma filled the cabin, rich and savory. At dinner, Sarah shot her a suspicious look, but Thomas ate with gusto, smacking his lips. "It's good," he declared. Walter ate his entire bowl without comment, but when he was done, he looked at my Leon for a brief second. It was a look of acknowledgement. The next day, while Sarah was outside, Mylene took the bowl of bread dough the girl had been pummeling. Her own hands, small but strong, knew the rhythm of kneading from years of helping her mother. She worked the dough, folding and turning it until it was smooth and elastic. She found a small tin of yeast in the pantry, mostly unused, and added a touch. She shaped the dough into 2 perfect loaves and let them rise in the warmth of the hearth. When the bread came out of the oven, it was light and golden, the crust crisp. She left it cooling on the rack. She did not present it as her own work, she simply left it there. At supper, Sarah cut into the loaf, her brow furrowed. She took a bite, and her chewing slowed. She did not compliment it, but she did not complain, either. And later, Mylene saw her take a second slice. It was a victory measured in crumbs. She began mending the children's clothes, her needle moving in tiny, almost invisible stitches that made the worn fabric strong again. She was making herself essential, one small, silent act at a time. Thomas was the first to capitulate completely. His initial curiosity blossomed into a full-blown attachment. He began to follow Mylene everywhere, a small, chattering shadow. He would sit on the floor while she cooked, narrating the adventures of his carved wooden animals. He brought her treasures from the forest, a perfect pinecone, a bright blue jay feather, a handful of wild strawberries, still warm from the sun. He would hold them up to her, his face beaming. "For you," he would say, and she would accept them with a small, gentle smile that was starting to feel more natural. One afternoon, he tripped and fell, scraping his knee badly on the rough porch steps. He let out a wail of pain and fear. Before Sarah or Walter could react, Mylene was there. She scooped him up, his sturdy little body surprisingly light in her arms, and carried him inside. She sat with him on her lap, murmuring to him in the soft cadences of her native tongue. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. His crying subsided into hiccuping sobs. She cleaned the wound with a gentle touch and wrapped it in a clean strip of cloth. He leaned his head against her shoulder, suddenly exhausted, and fell asleep in her arms. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching the entire scene with an unreadable expression. Mylene had breached the first wall. Sarah was a much harder fortress to conquer. She saw every move Mylene made as a criticism of her own efforts. The better bread, the tastier stew, the neater mending, they were all indictments of her failure to be the mother her family had lost. She resisted Mylene's quiet competence with stubborn, silent pride. She would pointedly rewash a dish Mylene had just cleaned or rearrange the pantry shelves after Mylene had organized them. It was a petty, childish war, and Mylene refused to fight. She simply stepped back, allowing the girl her small rebellions, and continued her work in the spaces Sarah left vacant. The thaw came unexpectedly. Sarah had a doll, a worn rag doll with button eyes and yarn hair that had been her mother's. Its arm was half torn off, dangling by a few threads. One evening, Mylene saw Sarah crying silently in her bunk, clutching the broken toy. The next day, while Sarah was out gathering eggs, Mylene took the doll. With fine silk thread from her own small bundle, the one thing she had kept for herself, she carefully reattached the arm. She didn't just sew it back on, she reinforced the joint from the inside, making it stronger than before. She stitched a tiny, almost imperceptible flower pattern over the seam with a bit of colored thread, transforming the scar into a thing of beauty. She left the doll sitting on Sarah's pillow. When Sarah came inside and saw it, she stopped dead. She picked up the doll, her fingers tracing the new stitches. She turned it over and over, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. She looked across the room at Mylene, who was busy stirring a pot at the hearth, her back to her. Sarah said nothing. But that night, at dinner, she slid a bowl of freshly picked berries across the table toward Mylene's plate. It was a treaty, offered and accepted in silence. From that day on, the resistance ceased. Sarah started asking questions. "How do you make the bread so light? Can you show me that stitch?" She was still a serious, over-responsible child, but the hard, angry shell had begun to crack. Walter observed all of this from his silent, watchful distance. He saw the changes in his home, in his children. He saw the light return to Sarah's eyes and heard Thomas's easy laughter. He saw the way the cabin was filled with the scent of good food and the quiet hum of domestic peace, things he had forgotten were possible. He said nothing. Words were not his currency. His language was work, and he began to speak it to her. One morning, Mylene went to the woodpile and found it stacked twice as high as usual, with a neat pile of kindling set to one side. A few days later, the back step, which had a dangerous wobble, was firm and solid beneath her feet, a new piece of wood seamlessly fitted into place. He was answering her small acts with his own. He noticed her squinting in the dim lamplight as she mended clothes in the evenings. The next week, he came back from a trip to town with a new oil lamp, its glass chimney shining, and a full can of oil. He simply set it on the table near her usual chair without a word. It was a conversation held across days, in the language of repaired steps and filled wood boxes. The most eloquent statement came one evening after a long day of hunting. He returned, weary and mud-splattered, carrying a fat grouse for the pot. After he had cleaned up, he sat at the table, his large hands busy with a small block of pine and a knife. Mylene watched him from the corner of her eye as she prepared dinner. He worked with a focused, patient intensity, the knife seeming like a delicate instrument in his powerful grasp. Shavings fell to the floor like soft snow. When the meal was ready, she set a plate before him. As she did, he placed his finished creation on the table beside her own plate. It was a small bird, exquisitely carved from the single block of wood, its wings half unfurled as if about to take flight. The detail was incredible, each feather delineated with a precise cut. It was a thing of delicate beauty, created by a man of brute strength. He did not look at her. He just started eating his stew. Mylene picked up the bird. It was smooth and warm in her palm. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever been given. She looked at the giant, silent man across the table, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear or duty. It was a fragile, tentative warmth, as delicate as the carved bird she held in her hand. The fragile piece of the mountain cabin was bound to be tested by the outside world. As summer waned, Walter announced they needed to go to Prospect Creek for supplies. The trip itself was a source of anxiety for Mylene. The town represented the world that had sold her, the place where her value had been weighed in gold. As they rode down the mountain, the silence in the wagon was different. It was no longer the empty silence of strangers, but the comfortable quiet of people who had learned to exist together. Thomas chattered happily, pointing out squirrels and deer, while Sarah sat beside Mylene, asking quiet questions about the names of the wildflowers they passed. In town, the atmosphere shifted. Walter's shoulders seemed to tense, his easy mounting grace replaced by a guarded stiffness. People stared. They looked at the huge mountain man, at his two clean, well-fed children, and then at the small, foreign woman walking quietly beside them. Their gazes were a mixture of curiosity, pity, and suspicion. Mylene kept her eyes down, feeling the weight of their judgment. Their first stop was the mercantile. As Walter was negotiating with the owner over the price of flour and salt, a man entered the store. He was dressed in a fine black suit, his face smooth and his smile polished. He exuded an air of prosperity and importance that seemed out of place among the rough-hewn miners and farmers. "Walter! Good to see you down from your peak," the man said, his voice overly friendly. Walter's face hardened. "Abernathy," he acknowledged, his voice flat. The man, Mr. Abernathy, let his gaze slide over to Mylene and the children. "And this must be the new arrangement I've heard so much about," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. A pleasure. He tipped his hat to Mylene, but his eyes were cold and calculating. He turned back to Walter. "I trust you're all managing well." Martha, bless her soul, always had such grand, if impractical, plans for that land. A terrible shame how it all ended. She had a poor head for business. A flash of raw pain crossed Walter's face, so quick Mylene might have missed it if she hadn't been watching so closely. He grabbed his sacks of flour. "We're managing," he said, his voice tight. He paid the storekeeper and herded his family out of the store, avoiding Abernathy's gaze. The encounter left a sour taste in my Leon's mouth. Abernathy's words had been laced with something sharp and cruel beneath the polite surface. On the ride home, Walter was more silent than usual, a storm cloud of unspoken anger radiating from him. My Leon filed the name away, Abernathy. She remembered the way Walter had avoided the man, the way his jaw had clenched. She also remembered a detail from the store. Walter had paid for his supplies with furs and a few silver coins, not with the gold that sat in the sack in her room. He was living like a poor man while sitting on a treasure. It did not add up. Something was deeply wrong, and she had a feeling Mr. Abernathy was at the heart of it. The quiet mountain life she was beginning to build was perched on a foundation she did not understand, and a man with a polished smile was watching it, waiting. The first snow of the season came early that year, a sudden, violent storm that swept down from the highest peaks and blanketed the meadow in a thick layer of white. It trapped them in the cabin and brought with it a far more dangerous threat than the cold. It began with Thomas. He woke one morning with a high fever, his small body burning up, his throat too sore to swallow. By afternoon, a faint red rash had appeared on his chest. My Leon's heart went cold. She had seen this sickness before, in her village in China. Scarlet fever. Highly contagious, and often deadly for the young. Walter was undone by terror. He paced the small cabin like a caged bear, his strength useless against this invisible enemy. He wanted to ride for the doctor in Prospect Creek, a perilous journey in the blizzard, but my Leon stopped him. "It is too late for that," she said, her voice calm and firm. "The storm is too strong, and the doctor may not come." And by the time he arrives, she did not need to finish the sentence. "We must do this ourselves." By the next day, Sarah had it too. She was quieter in her misery, but her fever was just as high. Walter looked at his two children, flushed and delirious in their beds, and his composure finally broke. He slumped into a chair, his head in his hands, a picture of helpless despair. This was a crisis my Leon understood. This was survival. All the quiet competence she had demonstrated in the kitchen and with a needle now came to the forefront. "There are herbs," she told Walter, her voice leaving no room for argument. "In the pantry. The ones I gathered this summer. Willow bark for the fever. Mullein for the throat. I need hot water and clean cloths." He looked at her, his blue eyes filled with doubt and fear. But he was a drowning man, and she was offering a lifeline. He nodded, and for the first time, he followed her orders. He stoked the fire, hauled in buckets of snow to melt for water, and watched in silence as she worked. She moved with a purpose he had never seen, crushing herbs, brewing foul-smelling teas, preparing cool compresses. She was no longer the timid girl he had bought, but a general commanding a battlefield. She sat between the two small beds, forcing sips of the bitter tea past the children's lips, sponging their hot skin, murmuring to them in her soft, lilting language. She did not sleep for 2 days. She was a small, determined rock against which the waves of fever crashed. In the long, quiet hours of the night, as the blizzard raged outside and the children tossed in their sickbeds, the silence between Walter and my Leon was finally filled with words. He watched her, his massive frame hunched in the corner, a silent sentinel. "How do you know these things?" he finally asked, his voice rough with exhaustion and awe. She didn't look up from wiping Thomas's brow. "In my village," she began, her voice soft, "we did not have doctors. We had grandmothers. Sickness came every winter. And famine. And floods. We learned what grew on the mountain. We learned what leaves brought down a fever, what roots eased a cough. To survive, you must see what others walk past." She paused, her hand gentle on the boy's forehead. "My own brother. He died of this fever. My grandmother did not know the right herbs then. She learned after. She taught me. So that no one else would have to lose a child the way she did." It was the most she had ever told him about her past. In the dim light of the lamp, he saw not just a capable woman, but a survivor forged in a crucible of hardship he could barely imagine. He felt a profound sense of shame for the crude transaction that had brought her here. He found himself telling her about Martha, his late wife. She hated this mountain, he confessed, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. She was a town girl. She wanted a fancy house, a shop. She borrowed money from Abernathy to buy things we didn't need. He encouraged her. Smiled and told her she had a fine head for business. He finally voiced the suspicion he had held for years. I think he cheated her. The debt just grew and grew. When she died, he came with the papers. He owns this land now. The cabin. Everything. The gold. He looked at the sack in the corner of my Leon's room. That was from a lucky strike, years ago. I kept it hidden. It was for the children. To buy this place back from him. My one chance to be free. As if summoned by his words, a knock came at the door a few days later, once the storm had cleared. It was Abernathy. He had a man from the town with him. He smiled his polished smile, feigning concern. Walter, my good man. I heard there was sickness in the house. I came to see if I could be of assistance. His eye swept the cabin, noting the two small figures still pale in their beds. It seems this is no place to raise children. A mountain cabin, a foreign woman who knows nothing of our ways. As the holder of your debt, and as a concerned citizen, I feel it is my duty to inform the circuit judge. For the children's safety, of course. They would be better off in the town orphanage, where they can be properly cared for. The threat was delivered with the pleasantness of a man ordering a cup of tea. He was using their crisis, their vulnerability, to take everything. Abernathy's threat hung in the air, colder than the snow outside. But instead of fear, my Leon felt a surge of cold, clear anger. He had underestimated her. He saw a small, silent Chinese girl. He did not see the woman who had faced down famine and fever, the woman who knew how to survive. While Walter was paralyzed by a mixture of rage and despair, my Leon's mind was already working. She remembered Abernathy's words about Martha's poor head for business. She remembered Sarah's doll. That night, after a tense, silent meal, she went to the large wooden chest where Martha's things were kept. Walter had never been able to bring himself to go through it. With a quiet "excuse me," she lifted the heavy lid. The scent of lavender and regret rose from the neatly folded clothes. Sarah watched her, her eyes wide. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "I am looking for your mother's hands," my Leon said softly. She carefully moved aside the dresses and linens. At the very bottom, tucked inside a sewing box filled with spools of thread and buttons, she found it. It wasn't a diary, but a small, leather-bound ledger. Martha's handwriting filled the pages, a neat, looping script. She had recorded everything. Every sack of flour, every bolt of cloth, every nail and pane of glass she had purchased from Abernathy's store. And next to each item, she had written the price. My Leon carried the book to the table, the new lamp casting a bright circle of light on its pages. She sat down, her face a mask of concentration. She herself had been to the mercantile. She had a sharp memory for prices, a skill honed by a life where every penny counted. She started reading through the entries, her finger tracing the lines. A sack of flour. A bolt of cotton. The prices seemed high, but she couldn't be sure. Then she found it. An entry for a box of nails, the same kind Walter used. She knew what they cost. Martha had been charged double. She kept reading. Item after item, the story was the same. Abernathy hadn't just extended credit, he had systematically, cruelly inflated every single price, creating a debt that could never be repaid. Tucked in the back of the ledger were letters. Letters from Abernathy to Martha, filled with his slimy charm, praising her vision, encouraging her to spend more, all while robbing her blind. It was all there. The proof. The weapon. The next morning, she showed the ledger to Walter. He stared at the pages, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. The pain on his face was terrible to see, but it was quickly replaced by a slow-burning, righteous fury. "He will not take my children," he said, his voice a low growl. Their plan was simple, and silent. The following week, they went to town. They didn't go to the bank or the sheriff's office. They went to the mercantile on a Saturday morning when it was crowded with other miners and farmers, men who also did business with Abernathy. Walter walked to the counter, Abernathy's ledger in his hand. Abernathy greeted him with his usual false warmth. "Walter! Back so soon? I trust you've considered my generous offer regarding the children." Walter didn't answer. He simply opened the ledger on the counter, turning it so the other men could see the neat columns. He opened it to a page detailing the price of seed corn. "Abernathy," he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the suddenly silent store. "I see here you charge my wife $2 a bag for this seed. Funny, because Mr. Henderson here sells the same seed for 1 inch." Every eye in the store turned to Abernathy. The color drained from his face. One of the other farmers picked up the ledger, flipping through the pages, a low whistle escaping his lips. "He did the same to me," another man muttered. "Always felt his prices were a bit steep," the whispers grew. Abernathy's reputation, built on a foundation of lies, crumbled in minutes. He was exposed not by a punch or a shout, but by a dead woman's careful accounting and a quiet man's resolve. Mylene stood just behind Walter, a silent pillar of support. When Abernathy looked at her, his eyes full of hate, she did not flinch. She simply met his gaze, and he was the one who looked away. They left the store without buying a thing, the ledger still sitting on the counter, a testament to his ruin. The ride home was the quietest yet. It was not a silence of anger or uncertainty, but of peace. The great weight that had hunched Walter's shoulders was gone. He sat straighter, the lines of strain around his eyes smoothed away. The threat had been vanquished, not with violence, but with truth. When they arrived back at the cabin, Thomas and Sarah, now fully recovered and rosy-cheeked, came running out to meet them, their happy shouts echoing in the clear mountain air. That evening, the cabin felt different. It felt lighter. It felt like a home. After the children were asleep, Mylene went out to the porch to look at the stars, which seemed brighter and closer in the high mountain air. She heard the cabin door open and close, and then Walter's large frame was beside her in the darkness. He didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there, breathing the same cold, clean air. Finally, he turned to her. In the faint moonlight, she could see the conflict in his eyes. "The gold," he said, his voice raspy. "It was to buy back my land. To give my children a future free of him." He looked at her, his gaze full of a profound, humbling gratitude. "But you did more than gold could ever do. You saved them. You saved this family. You saved me." His eyes fell on the corner of the porch, where her small, tightly wrapped bundle still Saturday. It had been there for months, a constant, silent reminder that she was a temporary fixture, ready to leave at a moment's notice. "That was the bargain," he said softly. "You don't have to stay." She looked at the bundle, the last relic of her old life, a life of obedience and loss. Then she looked back at him, at this enormous, quiet man who spoke with repaired steps and carved birds, who had stood with her against the world. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He leaned down, moving with a slowness that was a question, giving her every opportunity to turn away. She didn't. He kissed her. It was not the hungry, passionate kiss of a storybook romance. It was something quieter, deeper. It was a kiss of gratitude, of reverence, of arrival. It tasted of wood smoke and pine and the end of a long journey. It was a promise of a new beginning. When he pulled back, he didn't let go of her hand. "Stay," he whispered. It was not a command. It was a plea. Mylene looked at his tired, hopeful face, at the sturdy cabin behind him, and at the 2 sleeping children who had become hers in all but blood. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. Then, she turned, walked to the corner of the porch, and picked up her bundle. She didn't walk away. She walked back into the cabin, into her small room. And for the first time, in the warm, quiet dark, she began to unpack. Thank you for watching.